Peace, this is Doug. I've got my Digitac, and what I want to do today is just put a quick beat together and talk you through it. Since this is the first time I'm doing this, I want to do something very simple. So I'm just going to be using two samples from two records, and we're not going to be doing any arranging today. That's going to be a separate video. I'm doing this TV cooking show style, so I've already got my ingredients ready. I know the recipe. I've made notes. Spontaneity is a lie. For the melodic stuff, the sample is going to be You're Winning by Kraken. And for the drums, I'm going to be using Gaming by Osiris Marsh. And I'll put YouTube links in the description as well. I already have everything on the Digitac and loaded into the project, so let's listen to what I've got. So here's the Kraken record. That's one piece of it. I have this one too. And here's the Osiris Marsh record. This is actually two samples that I put on the same sample. I have these sped up to save some space. I also like the way that it sounds when you pitch them back down. The Digitac doesn't alias like the sample track does, but I still think that it sounds nice. I should also point out that I'm using little chunks of records as opposed to long or short samples, and that's because of some of the limitations of the Digitac. For folks that don't know the Digitac, you can record samples as long as 33 seconds in the recording buffer. If you want, you can import samples that are a lot longer than that. I generally don't. In fact, I think 33 seconds is usually too long for a sample to be on the Digitac. And that's because while you get this nice waveform view to help you navigate your sample and look cool in videos, you can't zoom in on it. So it can be annoying to try to find your way around a sample that's too long. You also lose a little bit of resolution and how much you can fine tune your samples start and end points, so it's all downside. On the other hand, you can zoom in when you're editing a sample that you just recorded in the recording buffer. So if you don't find it too tedious, you can chop everything down here, so you can just save like kick, snare, hi-hat, etc. as individual samples. But then you're going to run into the other limitation, which is that on the Digitac you work in projects, and there are only 127 available sample slots per project. And if you're chopping things down to the note, what you're going to find is 127 slots actually goes pretty fast. So I like splitting the difference and just going with these little chunks, and so that's what we're doing. So let's get down to the business. I know a lot of people go drums first. I never really got that. I'm chops first all the way. So we're going to start on track 4 because that's how I like to arrange my tracks. I go 1 to 3 drums, 4 to 6 chops, 7 to 8 question mark. This time around we're just going 1 to 5. Now if you know anything about the Digitac, you probably know that there is no dedicated sample slicing. The Digitac isn't really made for that. It's designed to work with one-shot samples. It's a drum computer, it says right there. If you want sample slicing, Electron wants to sell you an Octatrack. But you can still chop samples on the Digitac. In fact, it's super flexible, and that's because like all Electron devices, you can do parameter locking. So that means that any one of these parameters that I've got for a track, so everything from the pitch to the filter settings to the reverb send, these are all things that I can edit on a per step basis. And so that's what I'm going to do. But the parameters that I'm going to use are sample start, length, and sample slot. Again, I know what I want to do, but I'm going to go ahead and pretend that I don't, just so I can show you how you can put chops down and work them out. So I've got my sample. What I'm going to do is just put some trigs down and edit these start and end points. And I can also pull from the other sample by locking the sample slot. So now I can mess around with these using Trig Preview. I already know how this is going to go. These two are going to get pitched down 5 semitones. And altogether it's going to sound like this. this point, I should also mention that it's a really good idea to be in the habit of doing temp saves. And that's because, you know, if I tap one of these, it's gone. These aren't proper slices, they're just notes in a sequence. That also means that I can just copy and paste these notes around to where I want them to be, and so that's what I'm going to do. But first, I'm going to change my pattern settings. So by default, all of your tracks are set to be the same length as your pattern, and your pattern is set to 16 steps. But I want my tracks to be independent of the pattern, and I want the pattern to be 64 steps. I also want track 4 to be 64 steps as well. And what's going to happen is that this page is going to be copied over to each new page that I've created. So now I have these same trigs on each page. So for this first page, I know I just want these guys. So I'm going to delete these. I'm going to move this one here and this one here. For the second page, I want these ones that are pitched down. So that's going to be here, here, and here. And this one is also going to be page 4. And again, saving as I go. And so that just leaves these two. So it's going to be this guy here, this one here, and I never adjusted the tempo. So let's hear how this all sounds together. Cool. Make this one change here, and I think that's good. So now what I'm going to do is turn over to the drums, and what I'm going to do is get this little kick right here at the end of the sample. I'm going to copy this over here, grab this snare, and copy this here, and get the hi-hat. For this kick drum, I'm going to set a low cutoff and give it some resonance. And I'm going to give an envelope with a really short decay. For the snare, I'm going to give it a high pass with some resonance to sort of beef up the bottom end of it. So now I'm going to start putting down my patterns. And if you notice, I just like putting steps down, copying and pasting things around. That's why I prefer something like the Digitakt in the first place. I like step sequencing. So what I'm going to do now is edit the velocity on these ones here. And I'm going to adjust the bass width filter. I should give it some overdrive, and we can also adjust the micro timing too. So the snare is going to be boring. I'm just putting steps on 5 and 13. For the hi-hat, I can do something a little more interesting. I can parameter lock the other hi-hats in this sample. And then what I'm going to do, because there are only 5 of them, is I'm just going to make the pattern 10 steps instead of 16. Now you may have noticed that while I used tracks 1 through 3 for the drums as promised, I've only used track 4 for my chops. So let's address that. What I usually do is use the filters to separate the chops into lows, mids, and highs. This time around, I'm just going to do lows and highs. So track 4 is going to be the low end of that. But before I set the filter levels, I'm going to do something that I should have done when I was doing the chops. I'm going to set a really low decay for the amp envelope because I want this to cut off immediately when I mute the track. And I'm going to set the default note length to 6 steps. And then for these ones here, I'm going to set it to 4. Now I'm going to copy this track over to track 5 and copy the sound over to track 5 as well. Okay, now I'm going to dial in my filter values. One thing we haven't talked about yet is effects. I like to use a high pass on the reverb and kind of crank the decay. For the delay, I like using a high pass and a low pass as well. Crank the reverb send and the feedback. And I like to have the time a little bit off of whatever the tempo is. Alright, so last thing I'm going to do is put a little LFO on the filter for track 5. And then I'm going to adjust the reverb and delay sends. So that's going to be the end for today. I'm going to make another video a little bit later where we can get into making arrangements, and we'll talk about, trig conditions. We'll get into how to set up pattern chains and make everything flow together. But for now, I'm just going to play around with this loop and we can write out on that. But first, I need to make my shameless call to action. So please like, please subscribe, please follow me on Instagram, and please buy my music on Bandcamp. Peace.
you.